in every one of its parts. No wonder J.P. Morgan was scared of him. During World War I, Tesla conceived what would become radar, but could not get the financing to develop it because all of these people were telling everyone he was a nut. He also warned about what would become V-2 rockets and guided missiles. In 1931, Tesla told the press he was on the way to developing an entirely new source of energy from a new and unexpected source. 1934 New York Times headline, Tesla at 78 bears new death beam. The article reported that the new invention will send concentrated beams of particles through the free air of such tremendous energy that they will bring down a fleet of 10,000 enemy airplanes at a distance of 250 miles. Tesla stated the death beam would make war impossible by offering every country an invisible Chinese wall. That was his utter dream. He wanted to stop war because he'd seen what happened in his own homeland with war. And what he wanted to do is give every country this invisible shield that would prevent it from being invaded or attacked by enemy aircraft. What set Tesla's proposal apart from the usual run of fantasy death rays was his unique vacuum chamber. And it had one end open to the atmosphere. He devised a unique vacuum seal by directing a high-velocity airstream at the tip of the gun to maintain high-level vacuum. The necessary pumping action would be accomplished with a large Tesla turbine that he developed also. Tesla dreamed that his concepts would make war obsolete. He tried to go to the U.S. government with this, the Department of War. They weren't interested. He tried to go to the British. He tried to go to the French. He tried to go to the Germans. None of them were interested. Unfortunately, the Soviet Union was interested. And they wrote him a check for $25,000 and began work on his concepts in 1939. Now, you got to remember, back then, Russia was supposedly our ally. This is right at the dawning years of World War II. Just before his death, in 1843, he issued a statement that he had indeed perfected his death beam. But right after his death, his nephew, Sava Kasanovich, went in his room and found that all of his papers had been rifled through, many important things were missing, and a black notebook was missing that had hundreds of pages that Tesla kept, including a lot of pages that were marked government. The FBI came in, our wonderful FBI, and they said that the government was vitally interested in preserving Tesla's papers. Yeah, real good. Now that the guy's dead, they wouldn't pay attention to him when he was alive. 2 days after Tesla's death, representatives of the Office of Alien Property went to his room at the New Yorker Hotel and seized all of his possessions. See, Tesla never became a U.S. citizen, so he was considered a resident alien. Most of his remaining papers eventually made their way to Belgrade, Yugoslavia, where a museum was created in Tesla's honor. And because at that time they had the communist Tito regime there, all access from Western scientists, Western analysts was shut off. But of course the Soviets could look at anything they wanted. And that brings us up to date, or more or less. Now we're in our modern era, and as early as 1960, Soviet Premier Nikita Khrushchev referred to his nation's forthcoming scalar weapons. He addressed the Presidium, and he said this: "We have a new weapon, just within the portfolio of our scientists, so to speak, so powerful that if unrestrainedly used, it could wipe out all life on Earth." And now, in retrospect, we think that was probably a reference to the early beginnings of scalar weapons. Didn't take them long. The tip of the EM iceberg was that they used electromagnetic weapons against the U.S. Embassy. They bombarded the U.S. Embassy with microwave beams. And as a result, 2 U.S. ambassadors died of cancer. And many other people in the embassy were rendered ill and got lesser forms of cancer. But that's just the tip of the iceberg. The Russian military was not shy about using these unconventional weapons. And all of them were a whole order of magnitude under the scalar weapons that we're talking about this evening. Now, realize, most of you know the Manhattan Project was this enormous effort that the U.S. government put into toward the end of World War II to develop the atomic bomb and beat Hitler to the punch. Well, when the Russians went to work on scalar technology, they invested the equivalent of 7 Manhattan projects. So imagine how much progress they made. The first time we have any evidence that the Russians used scalar weapons militarily was in the incident of the USS Thresher. That was one of our nuclear submarines, and it went down very mysteriously on April 10th, 1963. It was never found. The reason why we think this probably was scalar is because, mysteriously enough, one day later, near Puerto Rico, there was a mysterious underwater explosion. Now, the authorities checked with the seismologist, they checked with the geologist. There was no earthquake, there were no underwater volcanoes, there was no explanation for this odd explosion. Soon after that, we began experiencing various downed aircraft. And then finally, in April, May of 1985, now this is 20 years ago, they brought their entire power grid online. They had their entire scalar weapons defense system up and running 20 years ago. That's when things really started happening. In November, for the first time, they started tinkering with one of our space shuttles. In December of that year, they took down an Arrow DC-8, which was a military aircraft. In September of '97, they took down several Titan 34D missiles. Now, these were several things. They were testing the ABM mode of scalar weapons. In other words, the ability to be an anti-ballistic missile weapon, to take out missiles. But they were also doing another thing. They were kind of pinging or tweaking our intelligence services, our military, to see if the military would go, gee, that looks like scalar weapons to us. But they didn't. And there's no evidence that the military had any clue of what was going on back in this time frame. Then there's the whole issue of weather. This has already been mentioned by Stan and also by Tesla. The idea that you can use scalar waves to control weather. You'll notice that particular Doppler weather slide there. You see that kind of odd thing down at the bottom off the coast of South Carolina. Well, those odd finger-like things, according to people I've talked to that are in the retired U.S. Air Force radar people, that is a sign of scalar activity. They created the deep freeze of 1967, which was really pretty awful, and they began full-bore weather warfare on our country on July 4th, 1976, our bicentennial, and it has not abated since then. Now here you'll see, these are just examples. This is a map of the United States, Doppler radar map. You'll notice that thing that's over Wyoming. That's very obviously not a natural cloud phenomenon. It's a perfect sphere. That is probably a Tesla globe. I have a friend who's an Air Force radar tech, and he tells me that when you see something like that and it's mostly hollow, it's almost certainly a scalar dome, a Tesla dome. Now look at this, by way of contrast. Here is a similar thing over Puget Sound, but notice how that's almost entirely solid. What that is a sign of radar jamming. If you see a totally solid thing like that, that's radar being jammed. And it was probably being done by our own military, because there's a lot of military bases up in Puget Sound area. This is an example of a very unusual cloud formation hovering over eastern California. Notice how it looks perfectly straight. In fact, it has a perfect hexagonal angle there pointing out up around northern California. Look at that. That's not natural. And what you need to understand is that with these scalar devices, they can steer clouds around the way you can steer your family car, moving entire cloud masses. Now, this is exceptionally interesting because this particular slide, there should be a thing coming up of a burst over Alberta, and of a similar kind of Tesla globe. And what you're seeing there is actually the detonation of a Tesla globe that's bigger than the province of Alberta. And what I want you to understand is that in the process of compiling all of this, there are also signs that show a very similar kind of globe materializing over Littleton, Colorado, the day of the Columbine shooting, and another globe materializing over Jonesboro when that particular place was experiencing the high school shooting. In addition to causing freakish tornadoes, the like of which have seldom been seen, the Russians also have been tampering with our oceans.